thinking about their fresh encounters, I'm also reminded that I've come to believe that you kind of just have to accidentally bump into or back into Lafferty. That's really the best way to discover him. I stopped long ago trying to give like recommendations to people, like where to start. That's something you are asked a lot when you're into some particular thing that's kind of obscure. And it's his work is too diverse and people are too diverse to really be able to predict what's going to work for different people. And I've seen things I did not expect to work for someone, and things I expected to work not work, and these sorts of things. So even on my channel here, I don't so much promote Lafferty really. I just, it's more I'm talking to the already converted, so to speak, or at least the curious. And so I just, enthuse and try to discuss and, hopefully scratch that itch for some Lafferty fans. And indeed, for new people just accessing him and going, wait, I want to know more, like these guys from these channels. But it's, it's just so cool to see them semi-accidentally kind of run into Lafferty in this way and find the occasion joyous. And as I said, I really like the way both of them play with the pieces, the fictional tokens and so on that Lafferty provides in his fiction, and really take a piece here, a piece there, and contemplate it for a moment and let it expand in your mind by discussing it. Which leads me to basically the second portion of this video, where I tried to describe something I think I see is happening in the burgeoning Lafferty readership. And I haven't really figured out a way to describe this yet. I don't think I've even observed the phenomenon itself long enough yet to understand it, much less, begin to describe it. But it's just something I feel eager to discuss. So I'm beginning to sketch it here. And it has to do with what I am calling Ludic mythopoesis, or, playful myth-making. And it's about this, kind of new reception of Lafferty that's happening in terms of individuals, communities, and weirdly, technology. I mean, I shouldn't say weirdly, that is our time. I just personally don't often think in those kinds of terms. And I don't know, it just strikes me as maybe not the first thing you might think of in thinking of Lafferty readership or something. But, maybe I'm alone in that, and everybody thinks about the technological aspect of these things. But in terms especially of YouTube and perhaps podcasts and things like that more generally, I'm just struck that Lafferty's sort of reputation and even influence may, for a time, kind of ride on these various readers' public reactions to his work, particularly their kind of recountings of his work and the way they sum it up and stuff like that, as it's colored by their impressions and associations. Indeed, to some extent, their expectations, though, like I said, this is usually more of a backing into him, bumping into him sort of thing. And as far as I can see with what's happening right now, it kind of starts with Matt from Bookpilled covering Past Master and then mentioning it from time to time after that. Then you get Vintage SF and their impressions of Past Master and Fourth Mansions and 900 Grandmothers and the Ace Special series. And then you have literally books followed closely by Liminal Spaces and their impressions and reactions. And everybody's trying to sum up Lafferty in these fresh, interesting ways that are creating kind of a meme mythos. I mean, remember that Matt from Bookpilled said it was... he said it was like, imagine... This is Past Master, right? He says imagine Cordwainer Smith, Gene Wolfe, and Franz Kafka teaming up to write a sequel to Bill and Ted's. He says, if you can imagine that, you're kind of approaching what Past Master is like. And so on and so on. And so, of course, there will be new readers that come to Lafferty based on these reviews and impressions. And so in that sense, it won't be as accidental as what I'm talking about. And so therefore, I think, the reactions are going to be very mixed. And, I don't mean to overestimate the impact. I'm not sure that this will garner more than a handful of new readers here and there. But when they go and try Lafferty's work, it will either exceed their expectations, perhaps, though almost guaranteed in ways they did not expect. And sometimes it just won't. It won't even meet their expectations, much less exceed them. because it's just too different from what they were expecting, or it just, whilst the description of it sounded as if it would be up their alley, in fact, what Lafferty does is just not to their taste. And so in either case, either something about the experience of Lafferty's fiction will urge the reader to try more, and they'll see how it goes from there, or it just won't. But that's where things get interesting to me in what I'm seeing here with this meme mythos. When people read Lafferty on the back of that and don't go further with it, that's not necessarily sort of a death blow to Lafferty reception, because the sort of playful mutations that these reactions, reviews, and descriptions are creating in the public imagination, they've already taken hold. And so that sort of almost outgrowth of Lafferty's work is already out there and has made its impact and is making its impact. And Lafferty, can be credited for that still, because he provides sort of the mother dough, if you will, that leavens culture in this way. Even if people don't go to the primary source or go to it and decide not to drink further from the primary source, that sort of podcaster, YouTuber, like Lafferty mythos is like already out there and doing work. It's very interesting to me. And Chris from Liminal Spaces even mentioned for a moment how weird it was to be trying to talk about Virgil from Literary Books, talking about his impressions of past master, impressions upon impressions. But this current sort of publicly viewable reception of Lafferty is something new in the world. This has never happened with Lafferty before, and it changes things. And obviously this is happening with everything that's being discussed on YouTube and in podcasts and so on. But there's two things that make this interesting in regard to Lafferty. And one is something that Lafferty will share with others, and that is that he's quite obscure and out of print. So there's a bit of a difference there when there's like a new reception in that way, or about something like that. And when you happen to be a person who is, intimately familiar with this really quite obscure thing, and then you watch it sort of take hold, even in the smallest of ways, which is all that's really happening, it can kind of give you a little bit of an uncanny jolt as you watch both the material itself of what you're interested in, like Lafferty's fiction, kind of mutate and cause a mutation in culture as well on the basis of that. But furthermore, and more importantly, there's something directly about Lafferty's work that lends itself to that, to some degree demands that, calls for that. And I'll get to that more in a moment. And it's something I've mentioned many times. As I kind of rehearse every time I say it, I get this from the scholar, Andrew Ferguson, who has written about this, particularly this one essay titled Escape from Flatland, How to Build a World in 3 Easy Steps. And it is a very academic, somewhat difficult article, but its general points, I think, are quite understandable. And it's something that he had talked about in his master's thesis as well, called Lafferty and His World, which is, I hope, still available online, because I know that Andrew feels that he has kind of outmoded that, and nobody gets that better than I do with earlier academic work. But it's still good. It's still, and it's also somewhat difficult, but less so. It has accessible qualities to it. It's a good conversation starter. I even have one of my oldest essays on Lafferty and McCarthy from, it's kind of embarrassing that I even put it up, but from when I was an undergrad. It was like my dissertation for, finishing the degree. But, I got a good mark on it, and I thought it was a decent little essay. So I put it up, and I've been tempted to take it down many times since doing further work on that, and not least the PhD thesis. But I don't really understand how academia edu works exactly, but allegedly, from information they're giving me, a fair few people still give it a read or have a look at it. And it strikes me that it might be the most accessible starter point for things I've done on Lafferty. And similarly with Andrew's master's thesis, Lafferty and His World. But what I'm talking about is this Escape from Flatland essay, in which, to my mind, he very persuasively and kind of conclusively shows that Lafferty formally writes his fiction in a way that leaves endings open-ended, in a way that requires active, intentional, creative reader participation in building the world of the story, completing the story, and indeed building the world. Big ideas there, but I think that is what's happening in Lafferty's fiction. And certainly, of course, this is drawing on theories of fiction that say to one degree or another. All fiction is doing this. But Lafferty seems to be very aware of this and constructing his fiction self-consciously around such an idea, and in super interesting and unique ways. And so these reactions that we're seeing and these summaries and these passing around of impressions about his work, I think are part of answering his fiction's call to readerly action. And we'll see where it goes. I don't think it's going to turn back. I think you can't unring that bell. I think this is now officially part of the Lafferty reception and mythos, as I'm calling it, that's out there and will be with us for a while. And to whatever degree it grows or not, this nascent discussion of Lafferty's works is larval to some unreckonable being, to put it in the words of Cormac McCarthy. And to those who know to what that quote refers, I must apologize for putting that image in your head. So as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of this thing that, of all people, C.S. Lewis says about another writer, George MacDonald. Both of whom I have a complicated history with theological fiction and indeed theology. And there have been times where I've not been entirely comfortable with my past obsessions with authors like C.S. Lewis, let's say, or George MacDonald, though that one doesn't bother me as much. But I've come to realize that despite all the problematics, both personally and more generally with these authors, that, damn it, they're good in their way. But you don't have to think they're good to get something from this quote. And I actually talk a bit about George MacDonald, one of my Patreon videos that I'm probably going to make a free bonus content because I'm just really proud of it. It's just like an hour-long discussion of Lord Dunsany, but it's cool. It gets into his stuff, and you should just hear his stuff. It's so great. But in that, I talk a bit about George MacDonald as well. So this is sort of an introduction to George MacDonald's works that C.S. Lewis wrote. And I don't know, I think I'm only half convinced by his argument, but I think it gestures towards something real and interesting. So Lewis is talking about how he's finding it difficult to assess and sort of place George MacDonald as a writer because in Lewis's estimation, George MacDonald's actual prose is second or possibly third rate, whilst his imagination is first rate, just beyond. And I do think that's probably a scandalous opinion amongst some people, but I have kind of always agreed with it and even kind of reassessed it more recently and still agree with it. Not that MacDonald can't write some lovely sentences and imagery and word choice and so on. It's good writing, it's interesting writing, but it is extremely uneven and suffers from the worst aspects of Victorian writing. In my opinion, it's kind of because MacDonald just doesn't love sentences and words the way, great writers or people that we think are great writers tend to do. Not that he dislikes them, I think he very much likes them, but I think he's just got a lot more on his mind. He reminds me of all kinds of authors that are more like this, with Lovecraft or Philip K. Dick or whoever, that prose style is not the first thing, it's this vision, this imagination that they have. And sometimes their style can be great and sometimes not, but the point is, look what they're handing you. And I think MacDonald is one of those writers. But so what Lewis kind of lands on here then is that George MacDonald is a myth maker. His work is mythopoeic. And at myth making as a sort of modern-ish sort of writer, Lewis reckons he's the best ever. And that gets him thinking, and he says this thing where he says, myth does not necessarily exist in words at all. And if you think about that and follow his train of thought here, it's very interesting. If you think of whatever myths Greek myths, or Lewis is thinking of Norse myths, and particularly the death of this god Balder that made a huge impression on Lewis as a adolescent. But when you think of these myths, if you think about it, you don't necessarily think of some particular version, some particular prose version or something. You may have received it through that, but you're just thinking of the events, or as he says, the pattern of events that could come through a lot of different presentations. And so Lewis goes on, if the story, and he's again thinking of his engagement with the Balder myth, he says, if the story is anywhere embodied in words, that is almost an accident. What really delights and nourishes me is a particular pattern of events which would equally delight and nourish if it had reached me by some medium which involved no words at all, say by a mime or a film. If you know of a myth performing mime troupe, please let me know. I got to see this. But I think he's onto something. That at its most extreme form, you could see a myth portrayed without any words at all. And of course, film would be something more recognizable, even with words. And I'm thinking here that kind of YouTube reviews can convey this to a certain extent, and all these different forms can nourish and delight you in that way that myths do. And so I like that it doesn't say the events, it's the pattern of events, because it's a little bit different. That means the events don't have to be exact or in the exact same order. There's just a certain pattern. You maybe even think like a sewing pattern or something. I don't know, that's something my daughter does. There's certain parameters that can be worked with variously, but so there is something solid and continuous there, but also has a certain plasticity to it to be used in various ways. And so the pattern of events, say in Lafferty's novel Past Master, are kind of being passed around the YouTubosphere or whatever in these interesting ways that are, I think, passing on some of that nourishment and delight of the mythopoeia of Past Master, delighting and nourishing people who haven't even read it and may not go on to read it. And to further make his point, Lewis then compares myth to poetry to show how not tied to words myth is comparatively. So he says, in poetry, the words are the body and the theme or content is the soul. But in myth, the imagined events are the body and something inexpressible is the soul. The words or mime or film or pictorial series are not even clothes. They are not much more than a telephone. And I think that reference to telephones is interesting. I don't know if you know the children's game Telephones, called different things, but where you pass around the circle some statement that you started with and see how it changes by the end. And of course, I'm not suggesting that if Lafferty's material gets so, quote unquote, warped or distorted through this passing around process that it very little resembles where it came from, that counts as this playful mythos that I'm talking about. I do think there's got to be some substance there vis-a-vis the original. But in a poem, you pore over the words and they're very important to the actual content of the poem. And I have to agree I think I agree that in a myth, that's at least way less the case. Certainly in terms of like classical myths and things. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that Lafferty's Past Master, for example, or really any of his other works are full-blown myths, probably not even mythopoeic to the level of somebody like George MacDonald. But I have been struck over the years that there is a mythopoeic quality to something about what Lafferty does amongst his other qualities. But if nothing else, there's something akin to myth, as Lewis is saying it here, to where when you pass on Lafferty in different words, you're still getting something of the potency of what he created conveyed. And Lewis goes on to make this interesting example that he says kind of proves it for him. He says, of this I had evidence some years ago when I first heard the story of Kafka's Castle related in conversation, and afterwards read the book for myself. The reading added nothing. I had already received the myth, which was all that mattered. Okay, maybe a super contentious thing to say about Kafka. I have not read The Castle. I suspect I wouldn't entirely agree with Lewis on this. But I still think he's kind of onto something. And in fact, I have, as an experiment, when I get a chance, I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna read the Wikipedia summary or some such thing of The Castle and then read the book and see, how much I think Lewis is right there. And as we're getting into Kafka here, it may seem like we're far afield from Lafferty, but like I said, Matt from Bookfield mentioned Kafka, and I have thought of Kafka a little bit, and I've mentioned that on this channel before with Lafferty. Now, of course, Lafferty is, in fact, in my opinion, a great prose stylist, and some of the essence of what he conveys is tied to his words, his sentences. That is an important part of what he creates. So this could never completely apply to Lafferty. This is what I mentioned in the previous video, what the critic Judith Merrill calls Lafferty's word music, that she says sort of casts a spell on her and is one of the main things that brings her back to Lafferty. So, prose is very important with Lafferty. Nevertheless, in lieu of getting to experience that prose yourself, seeing some of these summaries and reviews and impressions bandied about, I think can create certain reverberations that will give you some of what Lafferty expresses in his fiction. And to that point, as I just looked for this little bit of this essay by Lewis on MacDonald, because I was reminded of it, I then remembered, this contains another thing that Lewis said that has always been one of my all-time favorite quotes that I've used variously over the years. And he's talking about the sort of power and effects of myth, and when you experience myth. And I'll say how I think this relates to Lafferty. But Lewis says, it goes beyond the expression of things we have already felt. It arouses in us sensations we have never had before, never anticipated having, as though we had broken out of our normal mode of consciousness and possessed joys not promised to our birth. It gets under our skin, hits us at a level deeper than our thoughts or even our passions, troubles oldest certainties till all questions are reopened, and in general shocks us more fully awake than we are for most of our lives. Now, I feel like longtime readers of Lafferty will most likely say, yeah, I've definitely experienced that with Lafferty. In both, he quotes some obscure poem that I haven't been able to find, but possesses joys not promised to our birth. And he and Tolkien were big on the joy factor. And that's huge in Lafferty. But I would say with Lafferty, really as with people like Lewis and Tolkien, it comes through both the joys and the horrors that he conveys, that things are reopened for you. But if Lafferty doesn't break us out of our normal mode of consciousness, as Lewis says, who does? And that whole thing about it being like, this is about something, but I'm not sure exactly yet what it's about. That's exactly what Lewis is describing here, that getting under our skin, hitting us at levels that are deeper than our thoughts, even deeper than our passions. What's deeper than that? I don't know. But it is troubling these certainties that we have and reopening all the questions and just shocking us awake. And again, just go look at Chris's reviews. Look at the way he talks about, and all the skies were full of fish. And the way that Lafferty can reopen your ontological questions, so to speak, can range around from just kind of weird ideas, like Chris mentions in And All the Skies Were Full of Fish. Lafferty kind of throws out this idea that more populated places are better at controlling the weather and less populated places are not so. And, Chris just has to pause for a second and go, do we do that? On the surface of it, we're kind of like, of course that's not real. But Lafferty can get you to at least contemplate it for a moment. But to maybe, quote unquote, more serious and deeper things, Chris's interpretation of configuration of the North Shore, and Lafferty can reopen that question and shock you awake and just make you go, what the hell is it that we do long for in our dreams and our yearnings, maybe for this magical place or whatever it may be? What's going on there? Yeah, I guess, I would say, do you agree with that? And maybe what are other examples, other authors that make you feel this way? But as to Lafferty's work being almost meant for this kind of further layer of really creation, of creative interactions, because really that's what I find a bit unique about Lafferty that I don't necessarily see in a lot of other authors. It's always happening. I listen to so many great podcasts that are discussing fiction all the time. SF Ultra and Death Sentence. Those are two of the very best ones I listen to, and others. Whatever they're talking about, there's definitely a high level of creativity in the way they discuss it. And a lot of that is partly about what certain kinds of reviewers bring to these discussions. But to be fair, they're also curating a lot of, the best stuff that's out there, on the same level with Lafferty. So it is bound to be more productive in that way as well. There's still something a little bit unique, I feel, about Lafferty, or he's part of a set of authors that have this uniqueness. I even heard Horror Vanguard, there's another good podcast I listen to, but this is more about films and stuff. But talking about Lovecraft, doing kind of Marxist queer readings of Lovecraft and stuff, and talking about, in spite of the horrible attitudes in Lovecraft and stuff, he has a certain quality of opening up your world in that way that I was just talking about, and getting you to think about things that are usually outside the scope of thinking. But in any case, with Lafferty, there is this tendency to, when discussing him, this need to kind of creatively get involved and really add a little something. You know, that's the name of one of his story collections, Does Anyone Else Have Something Further to Add? Which is the last line of a short story, Nor Limestone Islands, that presents itself as directly as a sort of collage. It's the narrator keeps saying, here's a piece of this story, now here's a piece, put this one over here, put that one, you know, and like assembling the story. And then concluding, does anybody else want to add to this picture I've been slowly building with different pieces? Bring in your own pieces. And that's what I find happening in these reviews and so on. And what I love about it too, like I'm an academic, so that's what academics do in a certain sense, you know, and I suppose other kinds of maybe reviewers in print and different things. But whatever qualifications we put on YouTube, social media, podcasting, and so on, I'm sure there are all kinds of weird things going on there socially and what have you. Nevertheless, there's a certain aspect to all of this that distributes accessibility and discussion more widely than academia and many other formats and forums, such that anybody who just loves to read and can talk about it a little bit, wants to sit down and make a video, can discuss these things, and in this case can discuss Lafferty and can bring their little pieces that they add to it. You know, it's a little bit punk rock in that way, in that it's like, yeah, you don't have to be some academic or great orator or something, as I all too well display. So Lafferty is being discussed in a more general way that way. And Lafferty, I think, sits in this interesting in-between place where, you know, you've got your myths that can be conveyed without any particular wording, maybe even without wording, bring the mimes. But on the other hand, take somebody like Gene Wolfe, who's been our main point of comparison here. You do also, of course, see everyone discussing Gene Wolfe and doing similar things, kind of summarizing and passing on impressions that do kind of build on from the book and are their own things, has a different life from that, and Wolfe certainly requires reader participation and all these things. But I would suggest one of the reasons that there's so much debate, interpretive debate around Wolfe, is that there is a lot more, not only concrete detail, but I want to say definitive detail in Wolfe. It's more that it is, a lot of it maybe is expressed in a semi-definitive way that requires some interpretive choices to be made, if nothing else. Like, obviously, we can't say there's just this right interpretation, but there has to be kind of solid maneuvers made, and you have to kind of land here to some degree to like express an interpretation. And of course, Wolfe's works are certainly layered, and there are multiple levels of interpretation going on there, and he states that explicitly in works like Book of the New Sun through characters and stuff. And you get that same thing in Lafferty. However, as I say, I think Lafferty sits productively somewhere in between these things, in that there's enough concrete detail and so on there that it's not enough simply to just summarize him completely apart from his own words. You won't get the full effect. But as I say, it invites more of that creative interpretation and less of like, here's a firm decision on how to interpret this, because of a certain sort of built-in multivalence to his works and what they say, often explicitly kind of almost giving you options of like what to see or what's happening in a given scene or something. I mean, I'm reminded at the moment of just the way he talks about the character Evita in Past Master several times, saying things like, you know, her eyes were either this color or this color or this color or this color, or her voice sounded like this or that or this or that, maybe a bit of more than one of those, you know. So it like invites these, are they contradictory? What are they? You know, how do you know, you kind of have to come up with a whole conceptual apparatus to even discuss it. But there's definitely some like raucous multiplicity going on in those concrete details that is more amenable to all of us jumping in and being creative with it than I think something like Gene Wolfe's works. But as I say, is more, you need Lafferty's wording though more than you do with pure myth. And aside from that story, Nor Limestone Islands, one of Lafferty's clearest sort of programmatic statements of his project in this way is his little intro to the book, The Devil is Dead, which I've talked about before on this channel. And despite its cover, it is not an all-out Boschian fantasy novel. It's a little closer to kind of like a gentle magical realism, gentle on the level of its sort of supernatural qualities, so to speak. It has its own raucous moments. It's one of his very best. It's, to me, maybe his most just purely literary novel. And it's the usual fun and funny and all these things, and bizarre in its way. But the people are said to be a giant, an ogress, a mermaid, a this, that, and the other. There is a character that probably is the devil or a son of the devil or something like that. And when people are called these things, it's not really metaphors. It's like more like, I guess, archetypes and things, but it's tapping into something about their depths and something about who they really are. So there is kind of a magical, fantastical overlay to it that then, this cover does make sense of. So when you hear him talk about monsters and mermaids and stuff in this part that I'm going to read, I just wanted you to understand that, don't expect literal that kind of stuff in this novel. And this little intro is called Promantia, which I always thought was just some kind of more fancy Latin-esque word for, preface or prologue or something. But it's way more interesting than that. Of course it is. It's Lafferty. I don't fully understand the concept yet, but apparently it's tied to the Oracle of Delphi, no less. So it's already very suggestive of that way. But apparently it's this sort of conferred title that was given by the Oracle to other maybe nation states or something, where they got almost, apart from the people at Delphi, they got like first dibs on the oracles, on the prophecies or visionary statements or whatever. And I'm like, wait, okay. So I think maybe Lafferty's saying, look, this is your Promantia. I confer it upon you. I give you permission to get in here first at the site of the oracle and do this with it. And so he says a handful of things in the first paragraph or so about some of the details of the story, like you'll find the devil in here and where he was buried and the actual longitude and latitude of earthly paradise. And and one other thing you should know is that some of the main characters have this sort of octopus symbol sort of under their skin on their wrist that signals they're some kind of like pre-human race, Neanderthals or something, pre-human or parahuman. But then he gets to the crux of what I'm talking about here, and he says this: "We will not lie to you. This is a do-it-yourself thriller or nightmare. Its present order is only the way it comes in the box. Arrange it as you will. Set off the devils and the monsters, the wonderful beauties and the foul murderers, the ships and the oceans of middle space, the corpses and the revenants. Set them off in whatever apposition you wish. Glance quickly to discover whether you have not the mark on your own left wrist, barely under the skin. Build with these colored blocks your own dramas of love and death and degradation. Learn the true topography. The monstrous and wonderful archetypes are not inside you, not in your own unconscious. You are inside them, trapped and howling to get out. Build things with this, as with an old Structo set. Here is the devil himself with his several faces. Here is an ogress and a mermaid, both of them passing as ordinary women to the sightless. Here is a body, which you yourself may bury in the sand. Here is the mark of the false octopus that has either 7 or 9 tentacles. Here is the shock when the very dead man that you helped bury continues on his way as a very live man and looks at you as though he knows something that you do not. Here is a suitcase with 36,000 pieces of very special paper in it. Here is Mr. X and a left-footed killer who follows and follows. Here are those of a different flesh, and may you yourself not be of that different flesh. Put the nightmare together. If you do not wake up screaming, you have not put it together well." Yeah, so, wow. Very cool and a lot going on there. But this is genuinely what Lafferty does. He says, look, here's a box full of goodies. I've set them out in a certain way, but you're allowed to rearrange them. This is a do-it-yourself thriller. This is DIY fiction, your DIY, not mine, says Lafferty. He does give some pretty concrete direction in that he says, look, you need to put this nightmare together, but if you don't wake up screaming, you didn't put it together right, because it is a nightmare. Or as I've said before, like Past Master and different things, it has these nightmarish qualities. That's one of the things Delaney said about Past Master. But there needs to be a spooky element to this. I've said that Lafferty writes in a horror comic mode, and it's important that those things are fused together in his work. Yeah, and I think that speaks to what I'm saying here about the way people are receiving and summarizing and so on. Lafferty, it can't just be any old thing that gets so far away from the source that it no longer resembles it, but to the degree that it's working really meaningfully and substantially with what Lafferty's putting out there, but then creating new things out of it and setting them up how it wants to, playing at it, being ludic, then you're doing exactly what Lafferty wants us to do, and he's already implicated you. You might have the mark under your wrist. This is the way his novel Fourth Mansions opens. Lafferty, again, in that raconteur style, is always addressing the reader directly, or frequently comes back to that. But at the opening of this novel, as he describes these tentacles of lightning coming down, he says they're striking the ground and that they're at your very feet, the reader. And he says, you who glanced in here but for a moment, you are already snake bit. It is too late for you to withdraw. The damage is done to you. That faintly odd taste in your mouth, that smallest of tingles which you feel, they signal the snake death. Die a little. There is reason for it. Yeah, just, Lafferty just implicating the reader all the time and saying, you're in on this. We're doing this together. Let's make this happen. And that's what I see happening in these reviews, and it's very exciting. And lastly, finally, given that there's this kind of burgeoning new reception, it does create a certain desire in me, a wish for Lafferty's readership, that it would become more diverse. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm loving, all of us white dudes interacting with each other about this white dude's fiction. But, as with really everything, but, I think Lafferty's works would benefit from more diversity in that way. Non-white, non-male, queer, etc. sort of readers would be very welcome in this discussion and help us play with and build with his materials in much more interesting ways. And, perhaps, hopefully, in more just ways and so on. And as I mentioned in a recent video, women critics and readers have been some of Lafferty's absolute most astute and acute readers and interpreters. Judith Merrill and Cheryl Smith, and they've been like total fangirls of the work as well, like even in their own words kind of proselytizing for Lafferty's works and stuff. And even more recently in the best of, Kat Rambo, a weird fiction author, Kat Rambo, writes one of the best introductions in here to the story Boomer Flats. I quoted it in my thesis. Hers and Jeff Vandermeer's are kind of my two favorites in there. And there's some other quite good ones, and then there's a lot of ones I think are a little wishy-washy. But she writes this really insightful intro. And so women readers continue to be some of Lafferty's best interpreters. And I'm reminded here also of a more recent author, I don't know exactly how to pronounce this name, but Rika Aoki, an Asian American author, who describes herself as a queer transgender writer of color. And I'll link to this article that she wrote, but where she cites, alongside the likes of Frank Herbert and Isaac Asimov, R.A. Lafferty as one of her main influences, and notes that those guys represent a certain kind of, old dead white dude hegemony, as she says in SF, that personally, I would actually like to be part of sort of dismantling and supplanting, but I'm not going to deny what an influence they are on me and how much they've helped my writing. And as she says, even though she, in her words, she says she wants to outgrow that hegemony. And so, people like that are an important part of the reception of Lafferty, the readership of Lafferty up to this time, and are creating new works. Again, part of this whole creativity and creative response coming out of that. And so I would just love to hear more of that, and again, it's not something I can really make happen or even really promote. I'm just kind of expressing a wish, because people just have to kind of fall into Lafferty by and large. And to be honest, I partly cite Rika Aoki to show that there is some interest there from people, but on the other hand, if people can't be bothered with reading yet another old white dude they've never heard of, because there's so much other stuff going on, both older and newer, that's outside that scope and that canon. So be it. That's fine. I'm just, as a Lafferty reader, I'd love to hear from other people than my demographic. And by the way, if you're the kind of listener or watcher who's going to be upset at her saying that that Lafferty is part of a hegemony of old white dudes or something in SF, it is amusing to me to hear Lafferty called part of a hegemony when he's like, his work is like so out of print and he's obscure and whatever. But I was thinking about this and I was like, it's such a legitimate perspective, because even when it comes to the really obscure writer's writer that has a cult following that's so experimentally doesn't fit and all this kind of stuff, it's still some old white dude that gets to be that category, when there are probably other people, women and people of color and whatever it may be, that could equally be in such a position. So, you got to learn to listen, to these voices when they say things, and just stop and consider for a moment. I understand. I have lots of angry responses to so many things I hear, but you kind of have to go, let that pass and then go, okay, let me try to consider what they're saying. And, she's in no way diminishing her love of Lafferty. He's key and crucial for her. She could have mentioned so many people, and she mentions like 3 authors, Lafferty being one of them. So if anything, I'm just like, thank you for mentioning Lafferty. That's rad. And, it does remind me how much I need to do so much more reading of authors out with sort of my or Lafferty's demographic or something. And I try to do that, but I need to do much more. And I'll mention again the podcast SF Ultra, where Sean covers all kinds of great like feminist SF, even from the time of Lafferty and different things in a really entertaining way. Definitely check that out. And, so many things he's reading are making it onto my TBR, which I hope to be able to talk about sooner than later. And on this same note, it's important to remember that Lafferty has been translated into Japanese and Spanish and French and Italian and various things, and, has an active readership and fan base in Japan and Latin America and so on. In fact, I wish there would be like a Japanese podcast or a YouTuber that covers Lafferty and like provides really good subtitles or something. But as I say, more diversity in readership is just going to make playing with and building with Lafferty's materials all the more rich and exciting and fruitful, and bring all kinds of perspectives to bear and bring out new things, and it's going to be fun. And fun is a very important part of this, not least for Lafferty. That's like a key, almost ontological category for him. So thank you so much to Literally Books for covering Past Master and inspiring Liminal Spaces to then cover Lafferty. And Liminal Spaces, Chris very kindly tagged me and called me out at the end of the episode and said, if you want to see more deep dive on Lafferty, come over to my channel. So that was very kind and nice of him to do. Thank you for that, and for the ongoing Lafferty discussion. Thanks for listening and watching, and let me know what you think about these things. And we'll see you with more Lafferty content soon. Thanks. Bye.